The fires had begun months before, small blazes in the hills, easily controlled by the local fire departments. But something about this season felt different. The winds were harsher, more erratic, pushing the flames beyond anyone's expectations. People spoke in hushed tones about the whispers on the wind, the strange way the smoke seemed to gather and swirl at night. It was as if the fire wasn't just a natural disaster, but something malevolent, something alive. Emma was visiting her friend in Los Angeles when the first signs of trouble began. She had always loved the city with its vibrant culture and sprawling skyline. But on this trip, something felt off. She woke to a dim, hazy morning, the sky veiled with a sickly orange hue. It reminded her of an old photograph she had once seen, one taken in the aftermath of a terrible wildfire. The air tasted dry and metallic, like something was being burned alive. The news reports were grim. The fires had spread too far, too quickly, closing in on the outskirts of the city. The authorities were urging residents to evacuate, but many of them simply stayed put, convinced it wouldn't reach them. Emma watched from her friend's apartment as the smoke grew thicker and the sky darkened, casting an eerie glow over the city. But there was something else. A subtle unease lingered, creeping in around the edges of her thoughts. It wasn't just the fire. It was the way people looked, the way they walked. Some seemed like they were in a trance, eyes hollow and unfocused, as though they were hearing something far off that no one else could. That evening, Emma and her friend Claire decided to drive out of the city, to get as far from the flames as possible. But when they stepped outside, the air felt heavy, oppressive. There was a distant rumble, like thunder, but it wasn't the sound of a storm. It was the sound of fire, deep and menacing, growing closer by the minute. As they made their way down the street, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She turned her head quickly, but there was nothing, just the empty street lined with flickering streetlights. But her skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Claire, sensing Emma's discomfort, laughed nervously. "It's just the smoke getting to you. It's messing with everyone's heads." But Emma didn't think that was it. It wasn't just the smoke. It was the air itself. Thick, oppressive, full of something ancient and bitter. She glanced toward the hills, where the fire was beginning to eat through the trees, sending up great plumes of smoke. And that's when she saw it. A figure standing just outside the perimeter of the fire. At first, she thought it was just another person trying to escape the blaze. But there was something wrong about the figure. It stood unnaturally still, its form almost blending with the smoke, as though it were part of the fire itself. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, and Emma felt her blood run cold. "Claire," she whispered, but her voice barely made a sound against the wind. "Do you see that?" Claire turned and followed Emma's gaze, but by the time she looked back, the figure was gone. "Nothing's there, Emma. You're imagining things," Claire said, though she sounded unsure. Her voice wavered. Emma shook her head, unwilling to argue, but she knew what she saw. Something or someone was out there in the fire, waiting. The wind picked up again, howling between the buildings, and Emma heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like the voice of someone calling her name. She stiffened. The whisper wasn't from Claire. It was deeper, coming from somewhere far away. Something was trying to reach her, The house stood still, almost too still. It had always felt that way, even when there was company. But tonight, alone, its silence was overwhelming. Emma sat in the faded armchair by the window, the only source of light a single candle flickering weakly on the table beside her. The flames seemed to have a life of their own, casting long, restless shadows that writhed along the walls as if they had minds of their own. The old house creaked. Shift of wood, faint groans that sounded like whispers from somewhere deep within the floorboards. Each creak made Emma's heart race faster, her eyes darting to the source of the sound before quickly looking away. She'd grown accustomed to these noises over the past few months, but tonight, for some reason, they felt different. It was as if the house had a consciousness, one that was aware of her presence and was waiting. The candlelight flickered, casting an even deeper shadow across the room, and Emma instinctively glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Her breath caught in her chest. The darkness behind her seemed to stretch a little too long, pressing in at the edges of the room. But there was no sound, no movement. Only the silence of the night and the faint rustling outside, as if the wind itself were reluctant to disturb the stillness. The house was situated on the outskirts of town, perched on the edge of a forest that stretched out like an endless sea of dark trees. Emma had always been drawn to the solitude of the place, the way it enveloped her in a quiet peace, far from the noise and rush of daily life. But now, that peace felt wrong. The isolation that had once been a sanctuary now seemed like a cage. Every rustle of leaves in the wind, every shift of air in the room made her feel like she was being watched. She turned her gaze back to the window. Through the dirty glass, the dark forest stretched before her, the trees like skeletal fingers clawing at the night sky. The moon was barely visible, its light obscured by thick clouds, leaving the woods shrouded in darkness. A chill ran down Emma's spine as she stared into the depths of the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw something move, just a flicker, at the edge of the forest. She blinked hard, but when she looked again, the shadows were still. Perhaps it was just her mind playing tricks, her loneliness twisting the shadows into something more sinister. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself, there was a feeling that lingered in the air, a presence that pressed against the walls, against the very glass she stared through. A soft rustling sound came from somewhere behind her. Emma stiffened. She didn't need to turn around to know that the room was empty. She'd made sure to lock all the doors and windows when she arrived. There was no one else here. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. Another creak from the old floorboards, closer this time, followed by the soft, almost imperceptible whisper of fabric brushing against fabric. Emma swallowed hard. It was so faint, so quiet, but it was there. Something was moving. In the silence of the house, even the smallest sounds were deafening. The candle flickered again, its flame wavering, casting shifting shadows across the room. She stared at the dancing light, willing herself not to look behind her. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. There was no logical reason for the fear to take hold of her, but it did. The air felt thick, like it was hard to breathe. And still, the rustling sound persisted. Soft, slow, deliberate. A sudden gust of wind made the window rattle. Emma jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows around her seemed to deepen. stretching and pulling in on themselves like a living thing. Her eyes darted to the window again, searching the dark forest for any sign of movement. But nothing. It was still and silent outside, the trees standing motionless in the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as the temperature seemed to drop, the air growing colder. She reached up to wrap her arms around herself, but the cold seemed to seep into her bones, like it was coming from inside the house, not from outside. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and the creeping feeling of being watched intensified. She felt a sudden urge to leave, to get out of this house and away from whatever presence was lingering in the shadows. But she couldn't move. She was frozen, her body heavy, as if the house itself were holding her in place, unwilling to let her go. And then it happened. A loud bang echoed from outside. It was so sudden, so violent, that Emma's heart leapt into her throat. The sound was deafening, like something heavy had slammed into the side of the house, rattling the windows. The candle flickered wildly and then snuffed out, leaving her in complete darkness. The noise lingered in the air, an aftershock that seemed to reverberate through the house itself. Emma's breath was shallow, her heart hammering in her chest. She tried to force herself to stand, to move, but her legs felt like stone. The room was thick with silence now, the kind of silence that weighed heavy, suffocating. The noise had come from the direction of the forest, from beyond the trees. But what could it have been? What could make a sound like that in the middle of the night? She strained her ears, listening intently, hoping for another clue, another sound to explain it away. But the silence remained, pressing down on her, suffocating her thoughts. A moment passed, then another. And just as Emma thought she might have imagined the noise, a faint sound reached her ears, the softest of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. She wasn't imagining it this time. Someone, or something, was moving outside. The footsteps were too soft to be a person, too rhythmic to be an animal. They seemed to be circling, moving around the house just beyond her sight. Her mind raced. Who could it be? Was someone out there? Someone who had seen her, who had been waiting for her to make a sound, to give away her location. Emma's pulse quickened. She had to do something, anything. But as she stood there in the pitch darkness, her ears straining to hear the faintest hint of movement, the sound stopped. The footsteps vanished into the stillness, as if they had never been there at all. Emma held her breath, waiting for the next sound, for the next sign that something was out there. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the silence was broken again. A loud, furious knock echoed from the front door, shaking the house to its foundation. The sound was unmistakable, too deliberate, too forceful to be a mistake. It was a warning. And just as she realized she had been holding her breath the entire time, the door creaked open on its own, as though the darkness had reached out and invited itself inside. Emma didn't move. She didn't breathe. She could only wait in the dark, heart pounding, knowing that something was standing on the other side of the door, waiting for her to open it. But she couldn't. Not yet. She didn't want to know what would happen if she did. The wind had died down. The forest, usually alive with the rustling of leaves and the whispers of creatures hidden in the underbrush, now stood in an unnatural stillness. Emma stared at the door, the heavy thud from outside still echoing in her mind, a chilling reminder that something had been out there, waiting, watching. The darkness inside the house was suffocating. She could feel it pressing in from all sides, like the house itself was alive, breathing, suffocating her. The cold had deepened too. The temperature seemed to drop even further after the knock. Emma wrapped her arms around herself and, for a moment, simply stood there, unmoving, as though the longer she remained still, the less likely something would happen. But her pulse hammered in her ears, and the weight of the silence felt oppressive. The moment stretched, almost unbearable, until the softest sound broke through the quiet. The faint rustling of leaves. Then, a single, sharp creak. The house seemed to exhale. Emma couldn't remain inside, suffocating in the thick air that weighed heavily on her chest. Whatever had made that noise, whatever had moved outside her door, had to be investigated. She could feel the need to know, the need to understand, gnawing at her insides. She couldn't hide from it. Not anymore. Steeling herself, Emma made her way toward the front door, her footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. Every step felt like it was dragging her into something darker, something more dangerous. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she gripped the cold brass handle. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the house, but she forced herself to turn it. The door groaned open, and the cool night air rushed in, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The forest beyond the threshold stretched out like a dark sea, the trees heavy with shadow. Emma stepped outside, her boots crunching against the dry leaves, and she glanced over her shoulder at the house. It loomed behind her like an old hunched figure, the faint light from the windows barely visible in the pitch black of the night. With each step, the forest seemed to press in, the darkness thickening with each passing moment. Emma's breath quickened as she ventured further, her eyes scanning the trees. The rustling sound had stopped, replaced by a near-silent hum in the air. It was a strange sound, faint, like an electrical buzz, only it wasn't coming from any source she could see. The forest, too, seemed to hold its breath. Then, just as Emma was about to turn back, she saw it. A small broken figure at the base of a tree, half buried in the fallen leaves. At first, she thought it was a pile of discarded clothing or some odd-shaped rock. But as she approached, the moonlight caught on something that made her blood run cold. A dollar. It was half buried in the leaves, its porcelain face cracked and worn. One glassy eye was missing, and the other was cracked, staring lifelessly into the black abyss of the woods. The doll's clothes were tattered and soiled, as if it had been discarded long ago, left to rot in the shadows. But something about it felt wrong, unnatural, the way it lay there, half forgotten, as though waiting for someone to find it. Emma stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the broken doll. It felt like the forest was watching her, every tree, every dark corner, waiting for her to make the next move. Her heart thudded in her chest, and she could taste the cold air in her mouth, heavy with the scent of decay. After a moment, she bent down slowly, hesitating for just a second before reaching out to touch it. The porcelain was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, as though it had been out here for much longer than she thought. She recoiled, her stomach churning, and quickly pulled her hand back. There was a sudden whisper. A faint voice scurried on the wind. Emma's pulse skipped a beat, and she spun around, expecting to see someone standing just behind her. But there was nothing, only the shadowy shapes of the trees. the forest stretching out in every direction. Her breath was shallow now, her heart pounding so loud in her ears that she could barely hear the forest around her. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. It wasn't a word she could understand, just a low murmur, as if someone, or something, was speaking just out of her reach. Her mind raced. It could have been the wind. It could have been the trees shifting. But deep down she knew it wasn't. Something was out there. Something was watching her. She reached for the doll again, her fingers trembling as she grasped its cold body. She had to get rid of it. The thought of leaving it there in the woods, forgotten and broken, made her feel uneasy. But as her hand closed around it, something in the forest shifted. The hum she had heard earlier grew louder, more insistent, and the whispering voices seemed to grow closer, like 1,000 voices caught on the wind, all calling to her. She couldn't explain it, but she knew she couldn't stay here. Not with the doll, not with the whispering. Emma stood up quickly, clutching the doll in her arms as she turned to head back to the house. But as she took a step, she felt something shift in the shadows. An unnatural movement just beyond the tree line. She froze, her blood running cold as her eyes scanned the darkness, trying to make out any figure in the swirling night. There was nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded, deepened. It was as though the trees themselves were closing in, their branches reaching out to trap her, to keep her here. She turned and sprinted back toward the house, the doll clutched tightly in her arms, the whispers growing louder with every step. The forest behind her seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, its dark limbs reaching out to pull her back. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she pushed open the door and stumbled inside. The warmth of the house greeted her, but it felt wrong. The air inside, once cool, now felt thick and suffocating, the weight of the night pressing down on her. Emma slammed the door shut behind her, heart racing. She had to lock it. She had to make sure whatever was out there couldn't get in, but as her hand reached for the lock, she froze. The doll had moved. It was no longer where she dropped it on the floor. It had shifted, its porcelain body now sitting upright, staring directly at her with its cracked, empty eye. The faintest of whispers, so soft she could barely hear it, seemed to rise from it, the words indecipherable but unmistakable in their malicious tone. Emma stepped back, her breath catching in her throat as the room grew colder. The shadows, once dancing softly in the corners of the room, now seemed to stretch toward her. The walls, once familiar, now felt like they were closing in on her, the air thick and oppressive. The whispers seemed to follow her every movement, shifting like the wind itself, impossible to escape. And then, from the other side of the room, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone, something, was walking toward her. Emma spun around, but the room was empty. She could feel it, though. The presence, something behind her, something waiting, patient, in the dark corners of the house. It was only a matter of time before it would come for her, just as it had come for the doll. The whispers grew louder, and as she backed away toward the stairs, her mind screamed in terror. Then suddenly, the front door swung open with a violent crash. The air shifted, the darkness seemed to reach out, and Emma felt her heart stop. It was too late to run. The door swung open with an unnatural force, rattling against the frame, as if something, or someone was trying to push its way inside. Emma's heart pounded violently in her chest as she stood frozen in the middle of the room, the whispering voices now louder, more insistent. They came from all directions, a cacophony of hushed murmurs that felt like they were vibrating beneath her skin. It was too much to comprehend. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. Every part of her screamed to run, but her legs refused to obey. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and contorted as if they were alive, reaching toward her. And the once familiar house now felt like an oppressive maze, a prison with no escape. The door, still wide open, groaned as if something beyond it were pushing against it, a heavy weight pressing from the other side. Emma forced her feet to move, her mind racing, scrambling for any sense of safety, any sign of normalcy. But the house felt different now. The walls seemed to close in on her, their angles sharper, the corners darker, more suffocating. She rushed to the door and slammed it shut with a force she hadn't known she possessed. For a moment, the house seemed to pause, holding its breath. The whispers faded slightly, but they still lingered, vibrating in her ears like an unholy hum that refused to cease. Her pulse raced as she leaned against the door, trying to steady herself. The house groaned, its ancient wooden beams sighing as if they too were weary from whatever malevolent force had entered. The chill in the air was unbearable now, like ice, creeping beneath her skin, sinking into her bones. But something inside the house was calling to her, the doll. Emma's eyes shot to the center of the room where she had left the doll. Her stomach twisted in knots as she realized with growing horror that it was no longer where she had placed it. The floor was empty. The doll had moved again. She scanned the room, her breath catching in her throat. The air felt thick with tension. The very fabric of the house seemed to tremble. Then she saw it, perched at the edge of the table, its cracked porcelain face staring back at her with an intensity that seemed almost knowing. The doll's one remaining eye gleamed in the dim light of the room, unblinking, cold. The whispers began again, faint at first, barely audible, but steadily growing louder. Emma's head snapped around, searching for the source, but the sound seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The walls, the floorboards, her own mind. It was impossible to escape. The pressure in her chest intensified as the whispers built, forming words she couldn't quite make out. Her thoughts spun wildly, each voice louder than the last, all of them twisting into something incomprehensible and maddening. Her heartbeat seemed to sync with the sound, and her breathing became shallow, erratic. She had to do something. Anything. Her eyes darted to the hallway beyond the door, the darkness stretching like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. But the idea of being in the house alone, in this terrifying state of unrelenting unease, was more than she could bear. She couldn't stay here. She needed to leave. She needed to understand. The whispers suddenly stopped. The silence was worse. For a long moment, nothing happened. Emma tried to calm her racing heart, but the stillness of the house had an unsettling weight to it. Then, just as she thought she might collapse from the pressure in her chest, a sharp, violent slam echoed from behind her. She whipped around to see the door to the living room had slammed shut with such force it had rattled the walls. The once welcoming hallway was now sealed off, and there, just beyond the threshold, in the shadows, there was a figure. No, not a person. It was too dark, too indistinct, but Emma could feel its presence, like a dark mass hanging in the air. She gasped for air, her throat constricting as the figure seemed to move, its form shifting and writhing. It wasn't human, and whatever it wasn't something she could outrun. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she fell to the floor, panic seizing her chest. Then, as if from the depths of her mind, a terrible primal instinct screamed at her to run, to get away, to find an escape. But there was no escape. The walls had closed in. In her frantic haze, Emma stumbled toward the hallway, her eyes scanning for anything that could help her make sense of the madness around her. Her gaze caught on a narrow door she had never noticed before, tucked away beneath the staircase. It was old, hidden, almost deliberately concealed. Without thinking, she rushed toward it, wrenching the door open with a desperate strength. The musty smell of old wood and mildew hit her like a wave, and she hesitated, her body screaming at her to stop, to turn back. But she couldn't. She had no other choice. The staircase led down, descending into complete darkness. She hesitated, her hand clutching the frame of the door, listening intently for any sound beyond the door. But the house had gone eerily quiet again. The whispers had stopped, and the air felt heavy with something ancient. Gathering what little courage she had left, Emma took a step forward, then another, descending into the black void below. The stairs creaked with each step, the wooden treads groaning under her weight. With every step deeper into the house, the air grew colder, the walls narrowing, the sense of being watched intensifying. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, alive with something unspeakable. At the bottom of the stairs, Emma felt a strange sense of foreboding. The basement stretched out before her in a wide open space, but it was shrouded in shadow, the corners filled with an unsettling silence. Her breath caught as she stepped into the space, her eyes adjusting to the faint light coming from a single, flickering bulb overhead. The room was cluttered with old furniture, dusty crates, and cobweb-covered shelves. But it was something in the far corner that drew her gaze. There, half hidden behind an old wardrobe, was a large wooden chest. Emma approached it, her heart pounding. The chest was old, the wood warped and cracked with age. It looked out of place, like it hadn't been touched in decades. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside, there was a journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the binding fragile. She opened it carefully, her breath quickening as she scanned the words. They were written in a hurried, spidery hand, the ink smudged in places as though it had been written by someone desperate, trying to document something that had no explanation. The first page was scrawled with a name, Harrison Glover. Her eyes flicked to the next page, where the words became more frantic. The house is cursed, the dolls, they come alive. The whispers never stop. We're bound to the forest. The pact must be kept. The words seemed to blur before her eyes as she flipped through the pages, each entry becoming darker, more erratic, as if the writer's sanity had begun to crack under the weight of their knowledge. There were drawings too, strange symbols she didn't recognize, circles within circles, arrows pointing toward the heart of the house, and then an image of the very doll she had found in the woods, drawn with haunting precision. Her stomach turned. The words were clearer now. The doll is the key. The curse cannot be broken. The forest is alive. It watches. It waits. Suddenly, A noise. A soft scuffle from above. A whisper so faint it could have been the wind. But Emma knew. She knew it wasn't. She slammed the journal shut, her hands trembling. And in the silence, she felt it. The unmistakable weight of being watched. She turned slowly. There, at the top of the stairs, the doll stood. It was no longer perched on the table in her room. No, it had moved again. And now it stood, its lifeless gaze fixed upon her. The whispers came again, louder now, almost deafening. And then, without warning, the doll's cracked mouth seemed to curl upward, just slightly, smiling. The house had become a prison. The weight of the dark, whispering presence inside was unbearable. Each moment spent within its walls felt like it was stretching on forever. No matter where Emma went, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to follow, suffocating her, making it impossible to escape the suffocating, haunted pull. The forest outside, with its stillness and shadow, had been calling to her. The whispers had started in the woods. Now they followed her even inside the house, growing more intense with each passing second. She had no choice. The journal she had found had spoken of a curse tied to the forest and the house, to the dolls and the darkness. If she didn't find the source of it, she would never be free. It was as though the very fabric of the house was alive, feeding on her fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. The doll was still in the room, staring at her with that cracked porcelain smile. She had to go. With trembling hands, Emma grabbed a flashlight from a drawer, her breath shallow as she made her way to the door. The house loomed behind her, silent now, watching her retreat. Each step out into the night felt like it came from another world, a world where the trees had eyes and the shadows moved in time with her heartbeats. Her legs shook as she walked down the crumbling steps of the porch and into the thick air of the forest beyond. The night was heavy. There was no wind, no breeze to bring relief. The air felt thick, clawing, pressing in on her as she stepped further into the woods. She could feel the forest shift around her, its trees reaching out with skeletal branches, closing her in. The ground beneath her feet was soft, squishy, like the earth itself was alive, breathing beneath her. The flashlight beam flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the uneven terrain. Emma's pulse quickened. The sounds of the forest were different now, too quiet, too still. The usual rustling of leaves and chirping of insects was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence that hung thick in the air. Every footstep seemed to echo, reverberating through the trees, as though the forest was listening, waiting. She could hear the whispers again. They seemed to be coming from all around her, faint at first, barely audible, just beyond the range of her hearing. As if someone, or something, was speaking just out of her reach, taunting her with words she couldn't fully understand. The closer she got to the heart of the forest, the louder the whispers grew, until they were all she could hear, reverberating inside her skull, inside her very bones. Emma? It wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice. She froze. She whipped around, her flashlight beam dancing in the darkness. There was nothing, no figure, no shadow, but the forest was alive with movement. The branches swayed, the leaves shifted, but there was no wind. It was as though the trees themselves were watching her. Emma? The voice came again, this time louder, clearer, almost a call, a plea. The ground beneath her feet squelched as she took a step back, but her legs felt like lead. as if the very earth was trying to pull her down into it. She fought against it, pushing herself forward, determined to reach the center of the forest where the journal had spoken of something. Something she had to stop. The path she had taken earlier seemed to blur, the trees closing in as though they were changing shape, reshaping themselves around her, blocking her path. Her breath was shallow now, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Her eyes darted from one shadow to another, but there was no escape. Every direction she turned felt like it led deeper into the woods, deeper into the dark heart of whatever was stalking her. Then, just ahead, she saw it. A stone circle. The moonlight barely illuminated the ancient stones, half buried in moss and vines, standing like sentinels in the darkness. There was something unmistakably unnatural about the circle. It was old, much older than anything she'd seen before. It felt wrong, like it had been waiting here for centuries for someone to step into its grasp. Her flashlight flickered again, and she heard it, the faintest sound behind her, a rustle in the brush, a crack of a twig. Turning quickly, she saw a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. Shadowy, indistinct, it moved in and out of the darkness, just beyond the reach of the light. She couldn't make out its features, but she could feel its eyes on her, could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on her like an invisible force. The whispering voices grew louder, now a chorus of unearthly murmurs that filled her ears. They echoed through the trees, all around her, as if they were coming from the ground itself, from the very air. Emma? The figure stepped forward. Her flashlight flickered one last time before it went out, plunging her into complete darkness. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The night around her pressed in, black and suffocating. The only sound was her own heartbeat, her pulse pounding in her ears. The only movement, the soft rustling of leaves in the dark. She was blind, surrounded by a darkness so thick she could feel it suffocating her, closing in from all sides. The footsteps came closer now, slow, deliberate. She wanted to scream, but her voice was lost in the silence. And then the voice came again. Emma! It was right behind her, so close she could feel the heat of its breath on the back of her neck. She whirled around. But there was no one there. Nothing but the trees. Nothing but the shadows. Her hand shook as she fumbled for the flashlight, desperately pressing the button over and over. But it remained dead, useless in her hands. Her throat tightened, panic rising as she stumbled backward, her foot catching on the rough ground. She fell hard, the cold earth scraping against her skin. The stone circle loomed in front of her, its ancient stones like silent witnesses to her fear. And then, as if answering the call, the air shifted. A low hum filled the air, an almost mechanical sound, like something large and unseen moving through the trees. The darkness around her seemed to pulse with life, the shadows shifting, undulating like living creatures. She turned to run, but stopped short. The shadowy figure stood in front of her, closer now, its form barely visible in the blackness. It was tall, looming, its face obscured by darkness. Its presence was oppressive, suffocating, like it had always been here, waiting, watching her. Emma's mind screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, trapped in the grip of something far beyond her comprehension. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had lived in this forest for longer than she could fathom. The figure stepped forward again, its form darkening as it approached. You should not have come here, the voice whispered, low and guttural, as though it were not human. Emma's heart raced. She tried to speak, but her voice was choked, swallowed by the weight of the forest. The curse cannot be broken, it continued, its voice swirling around her like a cold wind. The forest owns you now. You are part of it, like the others before you. You will never leave. The whispers surged again, louder this time, like an ocean crashing around her. The figure reached out, its hand, a mass of shadow and darkness, stretching toward her. She could feel it, its cold, oppressive touch pulling at her, as if the forest itself was reaching for her soul. With everything inside her, Emma shoved herself backward, scrambling away from the figure, her breath ragged as panic took over. The ground shifted beneath her, and she could feel the forest itself closing in, its darkness wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Her heart thudded in her chest as the figure closed in on her, its form fading in and out of existence like a specter, its voice now a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the very trees themselves. "You cannot escape," it whispered, and Emma could feel her body going cold. "You're already one of us." The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing she heard was the howl of the wind, the forest's hungry, waiting call. And then nothing. The forest felt different now, suffocating in its stillness. The darkness clung to Emma's skin, wrapping her in an unrelenting embrace that made every breath feel labored, every step uncertain. She could still feel the coldness of the figure's touch, the weight of its whispers echoing in her mind. She had to keep moving. She had to find the truth, the key to stopping whatever had come for her. But what that truth would be, she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Her heart still raced from the terror of the shadowy figure in the woods, the whispers, the cold darkness that seemed to take root in her bones. She had stumbled through the undergrowth, blind with fear, desperate to escape the overwhelming pressure of the forest. But now she was deeper than ever, lost among the twisted trees, the path ahead impossible to make out. Suddenly, a flicker of light, a shadow in the distance. Emma froze. There was something ahead of her, a small dark shape amid the trees, a structure, a building. She moved toward it instinctively, drawn by an unknown force, the whispers growing louder with each step. Her breath quickened again, the pulse in her ears loud enough to drown out everything else. The air felt thick, as if the very forest was holding its breath. She reached the edge of a clearing and saw the cabin. It stood in eerie silence, a decaying structure, barely held together by the remnants of its frame. The windows were dark and vacant, the door hanging slightly ajar, the wood weathered and worn. But something about it felt wrong. Too still, too silent. It wasn't just a cabin. It was a symbol, a mark of something old and wicked. The ground around it was dark, wet, as if the earth itself had been stained by whatever had happened here. The closer Emma got, the more the air seemed to thicken. The whispers that had followed her from the forest became clearer, more coherent. They swirled around her like a physical presence, pulling at her thoughts, urging her to turn her back. She wanted to leave, but her legs wouldn't obey. She couldn't move. There was something she had to understand. Her hand brushed against the rotting wood of the cabin's door, and she pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Stale air, damp wood, and something worse. Something foul, something metallic. Her stomach lurched as she stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath her feet. The darkness inside was thick, swallowing the dim light from outside, but her eyes adjusted quickly to the gloom. The walls were covered in grime, and dust filled the air like a heavy fog. The silence inside was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water somewhere in the cabin. She hesitated. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the whispers surged again, a chorus of voices now too loud to ignore. She couldn't understand them, fragments of words, of names, of commands, but they were all calling her, pushing her forward. She moved deeper into the cabin, careful of the broken floorboards. Something was watching her. She could feel it. The oppressive weight of the place. The sense of being trapped, closed in. There was no escape. No way out. The air seemed to grow colder as she moved toward the back of the cabin. She passed an old fireplace, the blackened stone untouched by time. And then something on the floor caught her eye. A stain. At first, it appeared to be a shadow, but as she stepped closer, she realized it was blood. Dark, dried blood scattered across the floor in unnatural patterns. Her stomach churned as she knelt down, the whispering voices now coming in jagged, broken tones. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows over the blood-stained floor. But the more she looked, the clearer it became. This was no accident. This wasn't just some random spill. The blood led to the base of the wall, where an old trapdoor was barely visible beneath the grime and dust. She almost didn't want to open it. There was something horrifying about this place. Something dark that felt like it had taken root in the very earth, but the whispers had stopped. In the absence of their call, there was only an unbearable silence. The door creaked as she lifted it, revealing a set of narrow wooden stairs leading downward. The air from below was damp and cool, the smell of decay even stronger than above. It was a tunnel, a hidden passageway beneath the cabin, leading into the earth. Emma hesitated. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn back, but the truth was down there. Whatever the whispers had promised her, whatever secrets lay hidden in the darkness, she had to face them. With a trembling breath, she descended into the tunnel. The air grew heavier with each step. The dampness clung to her clothes, and the wooden steps creaked under her weight. The walls of the tunnel were lined with jagged rocks, and the further she went, the colder it became. The darkness here was absolute. Her flashlight barely penetrated the suffocating gloom. And the whispers had started again. They were different now, more urgent, more insistent. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved forward, each step taking her deeper into the bowels of the earth. The walls seemed to close in around her, pressing in with an unrelenting pressure that made her head spin. She felt like she was being swallowed whole, consumed by the very darkness she had sought to understand. And then she heard it. A sound so faint. At first she thought it was her imagination. A scrape, a dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across the floor. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The whispers had stopped, leaving only the sound of the dragging. It was growing louder now, more distinct. Closer. Her pulse quickened, and she turned around, her flashlight casting frantic beams across the tunnel. But there was nothing. Only the cold stone walls and the oppressive silence. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as she moved forward again, faster now, her legs trembling beneath her. And then she saw it. A faint light in the distance, glowing through the tunnel. It wasn't the warm, comforting glow of an open space. No, it was cold, unnatural, a sickly light that seemed to draw her in, pulling her toward it like a magnet. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, surrounding her, pressing in from all sides. Her legs shook as she neared the light. Her hand reached out, trembling, to steady herself against the stone walls. As she approached, the light became brighter, sharper, and she saw what it was. A door. A door that seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. It stood at the end of the tunnel, its surface smooth and unmarked, but she could feel its presence. The door was the center of everything, the thing that had drawn her into this madness. She knew, without a doubt, that this was the heart of the curse, the source of the evil that had plagued her, that had haunted her every step, the thing that wanted her to open it. But the door was locked. Her hand trembled as she reached out, running her fingers across the smooth surface. The metal of the lock was cold against her fingertips, and she knew it wasn't just a door. It was a barrier, a seal, and whatever was beyond it, whatever lay on the other side, was the true horror. The whispers grew louder now, a cacophony of voices, all pleading with her, urging her to open the door. She stepped back, her breath shallow as she stared at the pulsating lock. The air seemed to thicken around her, pressing against her chest, and she could feel the weight of the darkness closing in. The screams, no, not screams, whispers now, screams that filled her ears, drowned out her thoughts, filled her mind with images she couldn't escape. And then, from the other side of the door, she heard it, a scratching, a scraping, like claws against stone. It was coming for her. The tunnel shuddered as the sounds grew louder. The door creaked, the pulse quickening, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. She had to get out. She had to leave. But as she turned to run, her legs gave way beneath her, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the pulsating door. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, now a deafening roar inside her mind. They clawed at her thoughts, urging her to open the door, to face whatever waited on the other side. Her body screamed to turn and flee, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted in place, the cold stone walls pressing in on her as the light from beyond the door seemed to draw her in, pulling her toward it with an irresistible force. Her hand trembled as she reached out again, her fingers brushing the metal lock. It was still cold, but now it felt as though something was vibrating beneath her fingertips, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to echo in her bones. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Open it. Open it. With a strangled breath, Emma forced herself to turn the lock. The door creaked open. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The faintest blue light spilled from the gap in the door, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the tunnel. Emma hesitated, but something in the back of her mind told her that there was no going back now. She stepped forward, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end, and crossed the threshold. As she entered, the world around her seemed to change. The tunnel dissolved behind her, and she found herself standing in a vast open space. The air was cold, unnaturally cold, and a ghostly bluish glow bathed the entire room, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. It was like stepping into another world, a place that had never seen the light of day. The walls were barely visible, obscured by the dense, swirling fog that clung to the floor, But Emma could make out the shapes of ancient crumbling stones scattered throughout the space. Her heart pounded as her eyes scanned the eerie surroundings. She could see figures in the distance, moving slowly, their forms shimmering and translucent, like ghosts caught between worlds. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes, those eyes, locked onto Emma's with a burning accusatory gaze. They were silent, but she could feel their judgment, the weight of their sorrow and anger pressing in on her. As she took a step forward, the air shifted and the figures moved closer. The fog parted around them, revealing more of their tortured forms. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she saw the details. Their bodies twisted, mangled in ways that defied nature, their skin a pale, sickly gray. They were the souls of the lost, trapped here, forever wandering in this terrible, liminal space. One of them reached out, its hand a skeletal, desiccated thing. It pointed at Emma, its finger shaking with the force of its condemnation. The others followed suit, their fingers all pointing at her, their empty eyes accusing her, blaming her for something she didn't understand. A cold shiver ran down Emma's spine. She backed away instinctively, her breath ragged in her chest as the figure that had pointed at her slowly moved closer. The ghostly figure seemed to glide across the floor, its form rippling in the bluish glow like a reflection on water. As it reached Emma, it stopped, its face coming into focus. The sight made her stomach lurch. Its face was no longer a face. It was an open, gaping mouth, a vast, hollow void that seemed to swallow everything in sight. The air around it grew colder, and the whispers surged again, louder this time, screeching in her ears. "You should not have opened the door." The voice was a deep, guttural rasp, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. Emma staggered backward, her mind spinning, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here, couldn't be surrounded by these things. But the whispers were everywhere now, surrounding her, echoing off the stone walls of this eerie, otherworldly place. "You shouldn't have come. You're not welcome here. The curse will consume you." The figure that had pointed at her took a step forward, its body trembling violently as its gaping mouth stretched wider, its voice becoming louder, more shrill. "They are waiting for you." It hissed, its voice rising in volume until it felt as though it was coming from every direction at once. Emma spun around, searching for an escape, but there was nothing, no door, no tunnel, no way out. The space was vast, stretching endlessly, filled with more of the tortured souls, each one pointing, each one accusing. And the worst part was that they all seemed to know her. They knew who she was. But then from the depths of the space, something else moved. A figure she recognized. A woman, standing at the edge of the fog, her body cloaked in the same ghostly blue glow. Her face was familiar, though it seemed older now, her features twisted in an expression of agony. The woman's eyes locked onto Emma's, and for a moment Emma felt a flicker of recognition, a memory, a fleeting connection. The woman was reaching for her hand extended. And despite the terror gnawing at Emma's mind, there was something in her expression that made Emma take a hesitant step forward. The woman's lips parted, and for the briefest moment, Emma thought she heard a whisper. But it wasn't just any whisper. It was her name, Emma. The voice was soft, tender, and filled with sorrow. Emma's heart thudded in her chest, and without thinking, she moved toward the figure. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening, why she was here, why these souls were pointing at her. "Come closer," the woman beckoned, her voice barely audible, as though she was speaking from a great distance. Emma stepped forward, ignoring the screams and whispers that now clawed at her mind. She could feel the oppressive weight of the figures around her, but all she could focus on was the woman, the connection between them, the knowledge she might uncover if she just reached her. The woman's hand extended further, trembling now, but still insistent. As Emma reached out, her fingers brushing against the woman's, something cold and sharp pierced her skin. It wasn't the woman's hand. It was the air around her, a presence that had been lurking just out of sight. A clawed, skeletal hand reached from the fog, curling around Emma's wrist, its touch sending an icy jolt through her body. She jerked her hand back, but it was too late. The woman's form began to distort, her face contorting in agony as her eyes widened in horror. The air turned cold, impossibly cold, and the figures around Emma began to writhe. Their bodies twisted, their mouths stretched open in silent screams, their hands reaching for her, their fingers clawing at the air. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, now a chaotic, mind-shattering shriek that rattled her bones. "No!" The woman's voice was a wail of desperation, but the word was drowned out by the horrific chorus of voices around her. The ground beneath Emma's feet seemed to shift, the stone beneath her turning to soft earth like quicksand, pulling her down. She tried to move, to scream, but the air had become thick, suffocating. The figures surged forward, their skeletal hands grasping at her, pulling her toward them. She could feel herself being dragged into the fog. The figures' cold, clammy hands gripping her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Their whispers became screams, their accusations drowning out her thoughts. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And then, from the depths of the fog, the door reappeared. It was standing before her, the same pulsating, vibrating door she had come through. But now, it was more than just a door. It was the only thing in the space that seemed real, the only thing she could grasp onto. But as she reached for it, the whispers stopped. The fog cleared, and in its place, there was only silence, absolute silence, except for one word. Emma. It was a voice, clear, sharp, and unmistakable, and then the door slammed shut. The air felt suffocating, as if every breath Emma took was tainted with a cold, metallic taste. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, suffocating her, crushing her under its oppressive force. The endless space, once filled with the tortured souls and the eerie whispers, had now been swallowed by an all-consuming darkness. It was like she had stepped into a void, a place where time no longer mattered, where the world had ceased to exist. The very ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting as though it, too, was uncertain of its purpose in this place. Emma staggered forward, her steps unsteady as the despair began to overwhelm her. Her mind felt fragile, as if the weight of everything that had happened was too much to bear. She could still hear the echoes of the voices, the screams of the lost souls, but now they were distant, muffled, as if they were trapped behind an impenetrable wall. She was alone, truly alone, and it felt like the universe itself was conspiring to crush her spirit, to tear away the last remnants of hope that clung to her. Her heart was heavy, with an unbearable sadness, a hollow feeling that gnawed at her from the inside. She had opened the door, crossed the threshold, and now she was here, trapped in this twisted, horrific place. There was no escape, no way out. She was surrounded by an endless sea of darkness, and with every passing moment, she felt herself being pulled deeper into it. She had come seeking answers, seeking the truth. But now, the truth had only shown her the worst kind of horror. The visions of the tortured souls, the whispers that followed her, the unearthly presence that had been waiting for her. It was all too much. She had made a terrible mistake, but she didn't know how to undo it, how to stop what had been set into motion. Suddenly, from the blackness, a figure emerged. It was like a shadow, at first indistinguishable from the darkness itself. But as it moved closer, Emma could see it clearly, a man, tall and imposing, with hollow eyes and a face that was both familiar and foreign. His features were sharp, angular, and his expression was cold, like someone who had seen too much, experienced too much, someone who had been broken by this place, just like she had. Her heart skipped a beat as recognition set in. It was him. Her brother? Ethan. He had been lost, taken by this curse, this nightmare, years ago. She had tried to forget, to move on. But the memory of his absence had always lingered in the back of her mind, an open wound that had never healed. But now, here he was, standing before her, his form flickering like a ghost, his face twisted in a mixture of sadness and despair. Ethan? Emma's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with disbelief. Is it really you? He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her, his eyes empty, devoid of any warmth. There was something off about him, something wrong. He wasn't the brother she had once known. This was something else. You're here, he finally said, his voice low and hollow, like the wind passing through a graveyard. You've come too far. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, her mind racing. I don't understand. What is this place? What's happened to you? Ethan's gaze hardened, his lips curling into a faint, bitter smile. This place is where we're all bound. The ones who have made the same mistake you've made. The ones who opened the door. But I didn't know, Emma protested, her chest tightening with the weight of her confusion. I didn't know what I was doing. I just wanted to stop it, to stop the curse, to find a way out. You should have never come here, Ethan said, his voice a cold reprimand. Now you're part of it, like me, like all of them. Emma recoiled, taking a step back. No, I can't be. I didn't. Her words faltered as the reality of what he was saying sank in. But you're still here. You're not gone. Ethan's face twisted, his eyes burning with a kind of empty sorrow. No, Emma, I'm not gone. I'm trapped. We're all trapped. This is the price for our choices. What price? Emma asked, her voice rising in desperation. What are you talking about? You didn't deserve this. None of us do. You don't understand, Ethan muttered, his voice dropping into a whisper. The curse doesn't care about what we deserve. It just takes. And once you've made that choice, there's no going back. Emma's mind spun, her thoughts racing as the weight of his words crashed over her. She had known there was something wrong, something she couldn't explain. But this was more than she could have imagined. Then what am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice breaking. How do I fix this? How do I stop it? Ethan's eyes softened for a brief moment, and for a split second, he looked almost like the brother she had once known, but then His expression hardened again, and he took a step closer to her. His voice was cold, but there was a hint of something deeper, something darker. "There is only one way to break the curse," he said, his voice low. "But you have to be willing to do it. You have to choose." "Choose what?" Emma's voice trembled. "What are you talking about?" Ethan's eyes flickered to the darkness around them, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw flicker fear in them, something raw and unfiltered. He seemed to hesitate before speaking again. "The curse doesn't just feed on the lost, on those who are trapped," he said, his voice barely audible. "It feeds on you, on the living, on the ones who are still connected to it. It's not enough to simply break the door. You have to sever the connection. You have to make a choice, Emma. You have to destroy it all. The curse, the darkness, everything, even if it means destroying everything you know. Even if it means destroying yourself." Emma's heart froze in her chest, the words settling deep into her bones. "What do you mean? What do you mean by destroying everything?" Ethan's gaze softened, but it was the kind of softness that only a ghost could possess. Something long gone, something hollow. To break the curse, you have to sever the tie. You have to choose who you will save and who you will sacrifice. The blood of the past is the only thing that will end it. Her blood ran cold. "Choose, Emma," Ethan whispered. "Will you let the curse continue? Or will you be the one to end it, no matter the cost?" She wanted to scream, to deny it, but the truth was sinking in. The whispers were louder now, rising into a deafening roar. The shadows stretched and swayed around her, as if they too were waiting for her decision. The weight of the curse pressed in from every direction, suffocating her, drowning her in its demands. There was no way out, no escape. She had to make a choice, a terrible, impossible choice. "Do it," Ethan urged, his voice now a distorted echo. End it all, or be consumed by it." The darkness closed in on her, and Emma felt herself being pulled into the depths. The choice was hers now, and whatever path she chose, there would be no going back. Emma stood in the suffocating darkness, her body trembling with fear, yet her mind was clearer than it had been in days. Ethan's words echoed through her mind like a relentless drumbeat, reverberating off the walls of the blackened, oppressive space. The curse, the pact, the choice. She couldn't escape them. It was all coming to a head now, and the air around her seemed thick with the weight of ancient forces, powers far beyond her understanding. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the overwhelming sense of dread grew as the reality of what she had been drawn into became impossible to ignore. She wasn't alone. The entity, the malevolent force that had haunted her family for generations, was here, somewhere in this darkness, waiting for her. The space seemed to close in on her, growing smaller and more claustrophobic with every passing moment. She could feel the ground beneath her feet shifting, a sensation that reminded her of quicksand, as if the earth itself were alive, pulling at her, trying to drag her deeper into the abyss. The air was colder now, impossibly cold, and the whispers returned. But this time, they were different. They weren't just distant murmurs. They were personal. They knew her. They spoke to her. "You have come to us, Emma." The voice was soft at first, distant, but then it grew louder, clearer. It was the voice of the entity, the one that had been behind the curse, behind the pain and torment that had plagued her family for so long. It spoke with an air of familiarity, like it had known her since the moment she was born. You are the last of your bloodline. The words sent a shiver down her spine. It was as if the very ground beneath her was shifting, warping with the weight of this revelation. She could feel something, someone, moving in the darkness, their presence growing stronger with each passing second. Emma fought the instinct to run, her feet rooted to the spot by some invisible force. A figure emerged from the shadows, but it wasn't Ethan. This figure was different, more unnatural, a towering form, draped in a cloak of darkness, its face obscured by shadows. It stood still, but there was a palpable sense of movement within the space surrounding it, as if the figure itself was a part of the very fabric of the cursed realm. The whispers died down, leaving a silence so profound it felt like her very thoughts were being swallowed by it. The figure spoke again, its voice like ice scraping across stone. I am the one who has watched over your family. I have seen the choices they have made, and now I have come to offer you a choice of your own. Emma's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but she could feel the weight of the figure's presence holding her in place. She was trapped in a world she didn't understand, bound by the mistakes of her ancestors. The curse. It's real, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She'd always suspected, but now that the truth was staring her in the face, it was more terrifying than she could have imagined. The figure tilted its head, and Emma felt the darkness grow colder still, the temperature dropping so sharply, it was as if her bones were turning to ice. Yes, it is real, but it is not the curse that controls you. It is the pact your family made. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the truth began to settle into her consciousness. She had heard the stories growing up, stories of a family secret, of an ancient pact made long before her birth. Her parents had never spoken of it directly, but she had always known there was something dark about their past, something they had hidden from her. Your family's bloodline was bound to me long ago, the entity continued, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves in a windless forest. In exchange for power, wealth, and influence, they gave me their souls. But I am not satisfied with just their souls. I have waited for you, Emma. You are the last piece of the puzzle. The weight of its words pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She wanted to speak, to argue, to demand answers, but her throat felt tight, as if the very act of trying to vocalize her fear would tear her apart. Your family's debt is great, Emma, the entity said, its tone almost sorrowful, as though it were explaining something obvious. And now, it is your turn to pay. Emma's mind raced, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. What do you want from me? She gasped, her voice a mixture of dread and desperation. The figure's eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed from beneath the shroud of darkness, a sickly yellow light that seemed to pierce through her, burrowing into her soul. The choice is simple, it said. The curse can end, but it will not come without a cost. You will have to sacrifice the one thing most precious to you. One life, and the curse will be lifted. You will walk free. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. She had been expecting something terrible, but the gravity of the decision before her was beyond anything she had imagined. A life. Someone had to die. Her mind reeled, her thoughts spinning in a whirlpool of horror and disbelief. Was this really the only way? Was this the price she had to pay for her freedom? The figure's form seemed to blur, shifting in and out of focus as it stepped closer to her, its presence looming larger with each passing moment. "The price is not negotiable," it said, its voice like the sound of 1,000 whispers. "You must choose. A life for a life, yours or someone else's. You will be the one to decide who." Emma staggered back, her mind spiraling into panic. She couldn't. She couldn't choose. How could she decide who lived and who died? It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the figure loomed over her, its presence an unrelenting pressure that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. "You will decide, Emma," it repeated. "I will not wait forever." The darkness swirled around her, suffocating her, making her feel as though the very walls of the cursed realm were closing in on her. The memories of her family, her parents, her brother, flashed before her eyes, each face a reflection of love, of pain, of loss. She had to make a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The entity stepped forward again, and Emma felt her heart stop. She couldn't look at it anymore. She couldn't bear the weight of its gaze. "I'm not your enemy, Emma," it said softly, almost kindly. "I'm only the keeper of the pact your family made. And now, you must fulfill it. Choose, or I will choose for you." The darkness around her seemed to pulse with an almost tangible hunger. The air crackled, thick with the power of the entity's influence. There was no escaping it. The choice had to be made. Tears welled in Emma's eyes as the crushing weight of the decision bore down on her. It was unbearable, the thought of losing someone she loved, of sacrificing them to this hellish place. But there was no other way, no way out. The whispers rose again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices urging her to choose. "Hurry," they hissed. "Make your choice." Emma closed her eyes, unable to take in the sight before her. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling with the weight of the decision. And then, in the depths of her heart, she knew what she had to do. But she wasn't ready. And as the darkness closed in on her, Emma was left with only one question. Who would she sacrifice? Emma stepped through the door of her home, her hands shaking as she closed it behind her. The silence inside was thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The world outside seemed so distant now, as though everything she had known had been wiped away and replaced with something darker, more sinister. The air inside felt colder, the chill crawling under her skin like icy fingers. She shivered as she closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. She could still hear the echo of the entity's words ringing in her ears, the weight of the decision she had made settling heavily in her chest. Had she chosen correctly? Had she sacrificed the right one? Or had she doomed them all? The house felt different, alien. The faint creaks of the floorboards that had once been comforting now seemed unnatural. The shadows on the walls stretched longer than they should, bending at odd angles, as though they had a life of their own. She swallowed hard, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but deep down, she knew better. Emma wandered through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. The once familiar space now felt like a stranger's house. The furniture seemed out of place, the walls closer, pressing in on her. The faint smell of dust and wood lingered in the air, but there was something else too. Something metallic, like the scent of blood, lingering just at the edges of her senses. She paused in the living room, staring at the spot where the doll had once been. It was gone. The space where it had sat was now empty, but the absence felt heavier than the presence of the doll ever had. There was no sign of it, no trace. It was as if it had never existed, and yet the feeling that it had once been there lingered, suffocating her. Emma's breath caught as she turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room for any other changes. The faintest rustling sound broke the silence. A whisper, barely audible, like the wind moving through a closed window. She spun around, but there was nothing. The room was still, save for the flickering of the candlelight. A distant creak echoed through the house, a sound that didn't belong. Emma's eyes darted toward the staircase, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was alive in a way she couldn't explain, as if it had absorbed everything, every dark whisper, every shadowy presence. And now it was waiting, watching her. She hesitated, staring at the stairs, but something urged her forward. The upstairs, the room she hadn't dared visit for days, beckoned her with an unnatural pull. She made her way slowly up the staircase, the wood groaning beneath her weight as though protesting each step she took. The silence in the house was now deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. As she reached the top, she turned down the hallway, her gaze falling on the door to her bedroom. The door was ajar, the faintest crack of light spilling from the room. She couldn't remember leaving it open. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The room was just as she had left it, or so it seemed at first. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, the air thick with the same unsettling cold that had permeated the rest of the house. But something was wrong. Something was off. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting over the furniture, the walls, searching for any sign of change. And then her gaze fell upon the mirror across from the bed. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light. But as she focused, she saw it, the shadowy figure standing behind her in the reflection. Her blood ran cold. The figure was indistinct, its features blurred as if it were made of smoke. But its presence was undeniable. It was standing just behind her, its form dark and looming, its shape unfamiliar, but its essence familiar. It was the same presence that had followed her for days, the same shadow that had lingered in the corners of her vision, the same oppressive weight that had pressed down on her mind, driving her to the brink of madness. Emma froze, unable to move, her eyes locked on the reflection. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching her, waiting. She could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, like 1,000 eyes boring into her soul. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, this isn't real. It's just in my head." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It had become a window into something else, something dark and dangerous. The figure behind her was no longer bound by the glass. It was there, in the room with her, as real as the air she breathed. She slowly turned, her legs shaking beneath her, but when she looked over her shoulder, there was nothing. The room was empty, the air was still, but in the reflection, it remained. The figure stood in the mirror, its form now clearer, its features slowly becoming distinct. It had no face, only an empty hollow space where a face should be. And yet, Emma could feel its gaze on her, a force so powerful it almost made her dizzy. Her breath hitched as she realized something else. The figure wasn't just standing behind her anymore. It was growing, expanding, taking shape. The edges of its shadowy form were beginning to stretch outwards, reaching toward her, as if it were trying to step through the mirror, to cross over into her world. Her heart raced, panic clawing at her chest. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the mirror. The figure didn't move, but she could feel it closing in, as if it were an extension of the very darkness that had consumed her life. With a trembling hand, Emma reached out for the door, pulling it open, her gaze still locked on the mirror. But as she stepped into the hallway, she heard a sound, faint, distant but unmistakable. A footstep. Her blood ran cold. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she glanced back at the mirror, the figure was gone. The reflection was empty. The room behind her was just as it had been. But the footsteps continued, growing louder. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned, her eyes scanning the darkened hallway. There, at the far end, just beyond the reach of the flickering candlelight, stood a figure, a shadow, taller than the others, watching her with hollow eyes. The presence was there, the entity, the curse. It had followed her home. It wasn't just confined to the house anymore. It had become a part of her life, part of her reality. And no matter how far she ran, no matter where she went, it would always be with her. As the figure in the hallway began to move toward her, Emma's breath quickened, her body frozen in place. Her heart thudded in her ears, the sound drowning out everything else. She could feel it, the overwhelming pull of the darkness, the weight of the curse closing in on her once more. And then, as the figure grew nearer, something shifted in the corner of her vision. A flicker. In the reflection of the mirror in the hallway, a shadow moved. The figure behind her was there again. But this time, it wasn't standing still. It was smiling.